I would say one of the things that has had the most impact on me, of course, was the assassination of Medgar Evers. It was just a bald, raw event of a man being killed, shot in the back for attempting to implement the provisions of the Constitution. I met Medgar Evers, I'm not sure exactly the date. At a staff meeting, Edgar had just been hired, and I had just been hired, and I met him at the annual meeting of the NAACP here in New York in 1955. After he returned to Mississippi and we went back to work, our work schedules, it developed that the NAACP wanted to get by a certain date as many petitions as possible seeking integration of the public schools in Mississippi at this time, so that I was assigned, I should say, to go to Mississippi to work with Medgar, because it was difficult for one person to do it alone. Usually two people, you had to drive to the different communities and then distribute the pamphlet, the material, and do the orientation. And it was more efficient and effective in terms of time if two people worked together to do these, put these meetings together and work with the groups. He had laid out the route for us to follow in terms of the pattern of getting parents to sign petitions. And he had to choose it carefully because it was necessary to have a meeting in a community where there was a facility, a black-owned facility available to do this. And generally, the meetings were held at night because people worked in the daytime. So Medgar had planned an itinerary, and of course we were driving. He was driving, I was riding. In this instance, and the goal was to go to X number of communities in whatever. I think we had allocated 2 or 3 days total in which to do this. And so that's what we undertook to do. And it meant that each night after the meetings, it was necessary to drive to Mound Bayou, Mississippi, which is a black town, which had a black-owned motel or hotel, whichever they called it. And that was about the only place in the Delta area we could stay, because you did not want to stay with any of the people. It would jeopardize them by having NAACP officials in their household overnight. Because somebody inevitably would report it to some white person, and then that particular family would be subjected to various kinds of intimidation or discomforts. So the drive, no matter where we went in the Delta area, we always came back to the Mount Bayou Motel to stay. And we drove, I don't remember the number of communities. I think we had set about a dozen communities to visit, to get the geographically a selection of schools so that they all wouldn't be clustered in one particular area. And this way, if one school were accountable and had to respond and was forced to integrate in that particular area, it meant chances are that the others would be affected without having to visit them each individually. So that was a project we undertook, and it was one which required assuring people of their rights and explaining in simple terms, because many of them did not, they weren't particularly well-educated people, so it meant that they had to be told about the step-by-step, and not to go into too much detail, but it was like teaching, and to some extent, in terms of getting these petitions filed. And Medgar was subjected to increasing pressures, and as he worked, I went back again because farmers were being subjected to economic reprisals, and we had to interview them to get their information in order for me to bring this back to the national office so that we can see how we could get assistance from them through financial agencies and whatever. At the same time, he was determined to get the voter registration and we call the voter education program going, and he was working on that and having meetings and getting people prepared to go to demand the right to register and vote. And the idea was to coordinate these efforts so that they wouldn't be working against each other, but complementary. And that was one of the things that Medgar was good at doing. And they had put together a collaborative effort across the state, which they call COFO. And they had students and the Freedom Riders and the SNCC and SCLC and the NAACP. They were all focusing on undertaking this kind of a campaign, and that wound up having several hundred students arrested, and they didn't have their group didn't have the money to bail them, to put the bond up so they could be let out. And of course, it wound up that the association had to go into its reserve fund to deposit $500,000 with the court to enable those students to get out and go back, and other people, whoever there was, go back to their homes in order to go back to school and their jobs and whatever. We didn't have a lot of money, and $500,000 in those days in the 60s was a lot of money. And we had also had the incident with the merchants where we had boycotted, and they had sued, and the Mississippi court had fined the NAACP for having boycotted the merchants, and so that money had to be deposited also, and it was not returned until several years later. So those were very difficult times. The powers that be felt that Medgar was a key in the sense that he was the rallying point for them because he knew the environment and he had the experience of working, and he was a veteran, and he had the skills and techniques to share with the people who were coming in, and most of them were just untrained folks from other walks of life doing this. And he was well respected by the people in our community, in the black community, and disliked by those in the white community, and feared by the people in governance because they understood the risks they were taking and the possibility that NAACP would prevail. And eventually it did, but at a great cost. Harry Moore was the first one before Medgar was killed, so that actually there are about at least a dozen who were actually killed because of physically being involved in the civil rights movement at that time, doing specific work on voter education and also the sit-in movement. You didn't think about that so much as the tragedy of what and the effect it had on his family, knowing his family and children, to have him shot in the back like that, from somebody hiding in a bunch of weeds across the way, simply for doing that which the Constitution provided that it should be done in the first place. It was the concern, I think, generally was for about the results on the family, rather than personal fear. I don't think people reacted with fear, that is, in the NAACP movement, because you understood that this was always a possibility, and it would become more accepting of the knowledge, not more accepting of the killing, but the knowledge that this is a possibility, but also at the same time that your life could not be governed by it, in the sense that you would stop if you were concerned about the good and welfare of the movement and of your role in the movement. You would not stop what you were doing wherever you were because of the fact that this happened, and tragically to him in Mississippi or in Alabama, or the children having been killed by bombs in the church in Birmingham. You learn to live despite what they might oftentimes think that this will be an example to stop people from being actively engaged in this fight. But it doesn't really. In most cases, it increases the determination to do so.